As Delta used to say, Delta is ready when you are. Well, it's a pleasant surprise to be preceded by my colleague from NYU and from the same department. All right. You may wonder why both of us walk with a cane. And I tell you, we are both veterans of the foreign war. And since I was wounded more seriously, I have to sit down. Well, seriously, I had a bad fall and fractured my lumbar. So I cannot stand up for too long, so that's why I have to sit down. And I asked for a mic, and apparently the Bulgarians speak with loud voice. They don't need a mic. But I try to emulate the Bulgarians, all right? Okay, my topic, as was already announced, all right, is peace theories, quest for peace, and cross-cultural theorizing, because there could be other types of cross-cultural theorizing. This symposium is supposed to be concerned with peace because of it's sponsored the ICD, and also the symposium is billed as the Cultural Diplomacy Symposium on Cultural Diplomacy in the UN. Although we are not meeting in the UN, I guess the very mention of the UN directs your thought to peace and peacemaking. So today, I'm not going to talk about the UN as an approach to peace, although I think the most fascinating and descriptive phrase for what the UN is doing or should be doing is to build peace by pieces. But I do want to start with peace theories. There are so many of them, but I won't have time to get to all of them, but I want to single out two of the most best-known peace theories. One is the democratic peace theory, and the other is the liberal economic theory of peace. First, a word about the democratic peace theory. This was first advanced by a German philosopher, since the ICD came from Germany. I don't think it's a stranger. Now, in the 18th century, 1795, when Immanuel Kant issued his famous Perpetual Peace, he was the first one to broach the idea that peace can be realized only if you have fulfilled the prior condition that there be a league of democracies. But immediately there are critics or dissenters who argued that democracies are not any more peace-loving than non-democracies. And in fact, they've worked out a long list showing democracies were involved in wars, and sometimes democracies were fighting wars between themselves. And I just mentioned a few of these wars. One is the Sicilian expedition of the 5th century BC, and then the Spanish-American War of 1898, and then the British Opium Wars in China, which was an attempt from the Chinese point of view to ram Indian-grown, India was a colony of Britain at the time, to ram Indian-grown opium down the collective Chinese throat. And then the Franco-Siamese War of 1893, Franco-Thai War of 1940, and then France's war with China in 1858, snatching away what used to be known as Annam, which was a Chinese vassal, but is now known as Vietnam. And then I'll skip one or two. And then 1974, Turkish invasion of Cyprus. And finally, the British-U.S. War of 1812 through 1815. So Britain and U.S., of course, were both, still are, democracies, but they fought a war between themselves. So this shows you that the democratic peace theory is not really empirically supported by many cases. So this takes us to the next theory, which is the liberal economic theory of peace. which underlined the making of the post-World War II Bretton Woods system and the GATT, now known as WTO institutions. The idea was that if things or values can be obtained or purchased from the world market, then you don't have to go to war. Well, this was one example was, now why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor in 1941? Well, it was because the United States was in the Philippines, which was still an American colony, and when the Japanese wanted to push down to the south in order to acquire the resources that Japan would need to fight the war, but the Americans were in the way. So therefore, Japan had to attack Pearl Harbor with the hope that the Americans would withdraw from the Philippines. But today, you think the Japanese would do this in order to reach to the sources elsewhere? Of course not. And so this liberal theory of peace, or liberal economic theory of peace, suggests just that if values can be purchased or obtained from the market or unrestricted market, then you don't have to go to war. It's much cheaper than to go to war. However, there are also dissenters pointing out that theory is not really working in all cases. For example, William Tabb, in his study issued in 2007, indicates that there were wars fought in Africa for rich resources such as diamonds and oil. But I would offer another example, which is in Asia, between China and Japan, fighting off and on for the seabed resources, oil and gas, natural gas, under East China Sea. And this is not to mention the dispute over the Diaoyu and Senkaku Islands, which also is supposed to have rich resources underneath. So therefore, this liberal economic theory of peace is not entirely supported by empirical examples. If you look into the history, in Europe, there were so many religious wars. So now, how can we, then if you make a comparison, that's what this cross-cultural theorizing comes in. Now, if you look at the Chinese, the traditional Chinese imperial Chinese tribute system of international relations, for the uninitiated, let me tell you what that was. It was so-called because it was surrounded China as the suzerain, and surrounding states, vassal states or others, would periodically come in, sometimes annually, to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor, because the Chinese empire was looked upon as the stabilizer of peace in the world for many, many centuries. Now, in this system, there were very little wars. As one Korean-American professor has made a study of the system through 1368, the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, if you know Chinese history, through 1841, which was 1 year before the British Opium War on China. Now, he found two important differences with the Westphalian system. If you came from Germany, you should be familiar with what Westphalia is, what the Westphalian system is, referring to the Western system of society of international relations or multi-states beginning from this 1648. Now, Professor David Kahn, this Korean-American professor, found two differences between the Chinese tribute system and the Westphalian system. One, in the Westphalian system, all states were supposedly equal because of the concept of sovereignty, but in fact, not equal. Just the opposite. In the Chinese tribute system, states, members in this system were not equal, but in fact, they were equal. Second difference is more important and more relevant to this talk. He found that in the Chinese system, there were only 2 wars in the period that he studied, covering 5 centuries. And China only started one of them. The other one was started by Japan. But he stopped at 1841. If he continued, there were more wars started by Japan later on. So China, during the 4 centuries, started only one war against another country. So therefore, this will lead us to think, what accounted for these differences? Of course, as is true with most quantitative studies, David Kahn did not provide an answer, a reason why. Now I want to supply the reason, and I think it's in the culture, because in the Chinese culture, in contrast to the Western culture, the emphasis is more on harmony, not on competition. Now, Max Weber, who was also a German, because he didn't know Chinese, he thought harmony, that doomed the Chinese forever to poverty, because he considered in a capitalist society, which meant to him during those days economic development. In a capitalist society, you have to be equipped to compete, and harmony made the Chinese unable to compete. But he didn't know Chinese, because the Chinese word harmony means both harmony and harmonization of conflicts, of opposites. And this is why the Chinese culture is very, very different from the Western culture. Confucius did not emphasize just harmony, but harmonization of opposites. And this is the reason why Communist China has been doing so well since the Dengist reform, because he was able to make 2 opposites work together, socialism and market. Now, the China model is successful because of the Chinese ability to make opposites work. But not all cultures can do this. For example, in ancient Greece, Aristotle openly said it's impossible to harmonize opposites. So if you are in a culture that believes the impossibility of harmonized culture, then you are destined to have more conflict, because the emphasis is on competition. So therefore, if this is the reason, then my suggestion is that we should reorient the way we teach our children, to teach them more about harmony and not about competition, qua conflict. And I was told I should limit my talk to 20 minutes to allow for plenty time of discussion. So I'll just conclude. It seems to me there are 2 ways that by which we can have a better chance of peace building. One is to have a cultural commitment to the primacy of harmony, as I already explained. The other, I didn't have time to go into, is the presence of a closely interdependent society, which, to borrow the term used by a Harvard professor, which is the vulnerability interdependence, meaning since there's a little bit of you in me and there's a little bit of me in you because of globalized economy, then for either of us to rock the boat would be like suicidal. So that would be the key to peace. All right, so either we have this cultural commitment to the primacy of harmony, or we have this what can be called the vulnerability interdependence. Now, the first can be taught in schools and in society, and second can be built institutionally. Now, I think that both can be done, but I think the first step is still the cultural one. So if there is any thing I can conclude my talk on, which I think it should be called peaceful cultural theory. So instead of the other theories, I would call this peaceful cross-cultural theory, and I have copyright on it.
So thank you very, very much. And now is your your time for questions and comments. I see the first one here. And as always, if you could introduce yourself too.
Good morning. I'm Major Hsiung from Thailand, and I have been in China for several years, also master degree and also in PLA University, People's Liberation of Army. So I am familiar with Chinese. I'm quite actually theory talking about the Chinese harmony and Chinese harmonization, but I have been there. I do not feel that because of the big population, one China policy, the society is very competitive. It's not, I don't feel this is harmony in China because everyone has to compete for themselves. In the ancient time, in the Confucius and the philosophy, I totally agree with that. But my question is go to the Chinese government, like soft power policy. It's about like also cultural diplomacy that they initiate, like for example, the Confucius Institute around the world, like try to express their identity around the world, which is successful in some countries, for example in Thailand, like we are most successful program than Chinese. But in some countries, like for example European country or in US, it's not that successful as they expected. So I would like to, can you give us an assessment, like for the next few years, what Chinese gonna do next, like after the Confucius, and it's not that success, what is the next step that Chinese gonna do with the cultural diplomacy in the world scale? Thank you very much.
Okay. I like the question because it allows me an opportunity to say things that I didn't have time to say before. Okay. All right. That's what the question answer period is for, I think. All right. What time were you in China?
I came China in 2006 to 2008 and 2009 to 2012.
All right. Okay. You see, change came gradually back. You see, in 1995, the Communist Party in China, for the first time, celebrated the birthday of Confucius. And ever since, Confucius has come back to China through the front door, not the back door, nor the side door. All right. Now, and Xi Jinping recently gave a very important talk on this, and there is a book on it. So how do you, he wanted to have national rejuvenation and going back to the high time or the ancient glory of China. But he also emphasized the importance of Chinese classics, including Confucian analects. So if you watch carefully, the communist leaders, they are different from our leaders here. They may talk one way and do another. Okay. The reason is, since Marxism, Leninism, and Mao's thought is written into the Constitution, they cannot openly say, we depart from this ideology and embrace Confucianism. But that's exactly what they are doing. Now, in 2005, Hu Jintao, who was then the head of the party and also head of the People's Republic, threw out the idea of building a harmonious society. Now, that was recently picked up by Xi Jinping, who is the current leader. Now, in his vision for 2049, or the centennial of the establishment of the People's Republic, he wanted China to be, just look at the sequence, powerful, one, democratic, second, civilized, third, and harmonious society. So harmony is coming back. In the past, in fact, this is an oblique criticism of Mao. There was too much conflict. The Cultural Revolution was the most serious conflict during the days that Mao was living. So now there's a drift away, a deliberate attempt away. But they couldn't say Mao was wrong. But what they are doing indicates Mao. They didn't have anything to do with Mao. And they are going. So harmony, why did Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping emphasize building a harmonious society? That means there is no more class struggle, or no more Marxist struggle, or no more Marxism. You have to be very careful. Kami talk. This is the professional language among students of the Soviet bloc politics. You can use that to China. Kami talk. The official talk of the leaders, communist parties. You have to be very careful. Don't take them at face value. Look at what they do. All right. What they are doing today is going away from Marxist class struggle and back toward Confucian harmony. Okay. I think that probably answers your question. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. My English is not well because I'm coming from a fresh country. You say that.
Where did you come from?
Fresh country, DRC, Congo, to Africa.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, you said that they are war in Africa because they have many resources, diamond, iron, gold, and others. And we know that maybe the UN, the Security Council know what countries and what society buy these resources, but it does stop it. We wanted to know why the cultural diplomacy can help to stop this situation, because we need peace in Africa to develop our continent.
You see, the reason why the liberal economic theory of peace is not empirically supported is because the theory looks at products which are already available, but not products to be created in the future, like resources underneath your soil, and you have to exploit these resources to make products available. So this was the reason you have wars fighting over natural resources, because they cannot be immediately bought from the market. All right. So if you ask me how we can improve that, well, yes, the UN may be one way, and then maybe we should find out a way by which competing claims can be resolved, so that these resources can be legally, legitimately exploited to become products that can be sold on the market. And starting from that day on, you may have peace.
We have time for maybe one final question or comment? Yes.
I just have a comment. It's interesting that I'm Monica, by the way. I'm studying in Taiwan for my master's in international affairs and strategic studies. And it's interesting because Taiwanese scholars also see the shift of Chinese leader. Former was Hu Jintao, and also today is Xi Jinping. There was even a story made by one of my professors. He's part of the defense of Taiwan. But the conclusion of the story, the short version of that story was that Xi Jinping's wife is a practiced Buddhism. And there's a shift somehow that could influence Xi Jinping also wanting other people to freely practice Buddhism in China. And it's also kind of like a cultural way of expressing for people. And yeah, and so I just wanted to add that too. It's not just shifting away from Mao's thoughts, but also adding some other culture or religious practices.
You see, you just pointed a finger toward the direction I wanted to go. Because, you see, for a Chinese, he can be a Buddhist, a Christian, a Marxist, or whatever. Because this idea that you can only be devoted to one religion, that's alien to Chinese. So in the past, a Chinese Confucian scholar could be at the same time a believer in legalism, with a capitalized L, or Buddhism, or Taoism, and other isms. So this is very true now. Xi's wife may be a Buddhist, but officially she should be a Marxist.
Yes.
And she should support her husband.
Yes.
Right? But maybe she also believes in other isms. But that's typical Chinese. And I think this is a great virtue, which means you can build a great tolerance of differences. Because in you have to reconcile these differences. And maybe that's the reason why the Chinese have been doing so well, trying to harmonize two opposites, socialism and market. Right? And I hope that people will pay attention to. All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's express our sincere gratitude to Professor Hsiung.